The moderator for our session today is Prexy Nesbitt, who is a longtime Africanist. He is now the Dean of Students at the Francis Parker School in Chicago. He's been with the Mozambique Institute, and gosh, he's done a lot of other things too. But I'll just turn the program over to Prexy Nesbitt, who will moderate.
Thank you very much, Al. Good morning. No, I come out of this Baptist tradition, so we need you all to wake up this morning. Good morning. Good morning. Yes, yes. Let the church say amen. I am very honored to be here with you. I'm doubly honored to have been invited by Al McQueen to participate in this tremendous program. And then I am humbled, literally, by playing the role of attempting to moderate the group of giants that you have on this panel with you this morning. An obvious fact is that as the baby amongst this group, although one of them reminded me that my beard has become white and my hair has disappeared, so I'm the white-bearded baby, I have had the pleasure of knowing this group of men, or having known of them in almost all instances, have known them over the last 25 or 30 years of my own involvement with Southern Africa, particularly Mozambique. So I feel very honored to play the role of introducing them and of moderating this program. We have with us Daryl Randall, George Hauser, Herb Shore, Ed Hawley, and Elliott Skinner. It would literally be until about 2 p.m. if I was to go through systematically and thoroughly all these biographies. If I was to be egalitarian and progressive in the mode that I have been raised and taught, much of which was done by some of these gentlemen, I would want to introduce all their spouses as well. Because this is a group of men who have in many instances been motored by their spouses, who have shown as much involvement and equal commitment on all these issues. And I would ask this audience to please acknowledge all of the spouses of this group of men. And I hope that you get to meet all of them individually. Daryl Randall will be our first presenter this morning. He has been a lecturer at the Hofmeyr School of Social Work in Johannesburg. He has been a professor and is retired emeritus professor from the School of International Services at the American University. He served as a field officer for the South African Institute of Race Relations. He was a director of the World Human Needs Institute. In the capacity of his work in South Africa, he first met Eduardo. He also played a pivotal role in helping to establish the Wilgespriet Fellowship Center, a center that has been instrumental in the whole struggle in the Southern African region. George Hauser, one of the founders and was former staff for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and for many years recently reassumed the post of acting director there. In that capacity, also helped to found, along with giants like James Farmer and Bayard Rustin, the Congress of Racial Equality. He was one of the first people to be part of the Freedom Riders going to the South in 1947. Served a year in Danbury Prison as a conscientious objector. Innumerable trips to Africa, every country in Africa, including attending the first OAU session in 1963. He is the founder and executive director emeritus of the American Committee on Africa and Africa Fund. Herbert Shore is Professor Emeritus of the School of Theater at the University of Southern California. He's a founder of national theaters in Tanzania. Let me add parenthetically that I had the great privilege as a student to work with Herb when we did a play. I'm sure he's forgotten this, in the University of Dar es Salaam, and what a joy it was to have someone who knows theater and drama as well as Herb Shore to learn, and we did the thing called Song of the Goat. John, do you remember that way back in 1965? I was, of course, 3, 4 years old, but it was back a ways. Former director as well of the UNESCO programs, any number of UNESCO projects, and he's currently working with George Hauser doing a book, the memoirs of Walter Sisulu, a biography of Walter Sisulu. Ed Hawley, let me proudly say to you, is my pastor. He married me and my wife not long ago. He's the retired, I think, Director Emeritus of Africa Today magazine. He was the Associate Minister of the First Congregational Church here in Oberlin from 1949 to 1954. He served at my family's church on the west side of Chicago in 1954 to 1964, and then did refugee work, working with the National Christian Council of Kenya and the Christian Council of Tanzania throughout most of the 60s, 64 to 71. Ed is currently remains very active, doing a lot of work with the American Friends Service Committee in Denver. And then as our commentator, we have Ambassador Elliott Skinner. Elliott Skinner was first ambassador, I think, to Upper Volta, appointed by Lyndon Baines Johnson. Dr. Skinner also was, and this is an extraordinarily important small fact, he was the second tenured African-American professor in the Ivy League schools. He's a professor emeritus of Columbia University. He has written 12 major books related to Africa and U.S. foreign policy, and particularly the role of Afro-Americans. And he recently authored a major piece for the National Summit on Africa currently going on. And he's currently working as well on his second volume of Afro-Americans and U.S. foreign policy for Africa. I am, again, I want to repeat, humbled to be the moderator for this group. Our procedure will be as follows. Each of our panelists will make a 10-minute intervention. They have been, besides being exposed to Eduardo Mondlane and Frelimo, they have been long-time presenters, so they will do this in a very disciplined fashion. They know Frelimo discipline, and additionally, we have a little secret code amongst us, so there'll be no passing of little obnoxious little notes or anything like that. And then at the end, we'll have Dr. Skinner make a response for 8 or 9 minutes to all of the presentations, and then we want to get rapidly to an interaction with you here. Let me urge, as we get started and as the first panelist will come forward, those of you in the back may want to move forward. None of us bite. All of us are very, very open people, so there are a lot of seats down here, and it will make it easier for people coming in late to slide into a seat. Again, good morning. Our first panelist will be Daryl Randall. Mr. Randall.
This is a personal privilege for my wife and I to be here. And I want to acknowledge also the presence of a very important person that's been interested in Eduardo all our life and has been very influential in encouraging us to be interested in Africa. That's Dorothy Nyland, 93 years old. Dorothy Nyland. Now, it's also, I appreciate your mentioning the spouses, because I wouldn't get by in our community in Washington if I had a panel of everybody who was men in this regard. And I would say that in case of my wife, she was a partner with me in everything we did in some of the radical things which we crossed the color barn in different parts of Africa, and especially in Johannesburg. And I'm glad that she can be here. Now, we met Eduardo at the Unhoffmeyer School of Social Work, where people were being trained to push the papers and so forth around for whatever the South Africa white government decided to do to keep the peace and the order and the discipline of the African people there. I was invited well, my wife and I were invited by Bishop Booth to be his secretarial assistants down through Africa, and spent a year in Belgian Congo in 1946 to get ready to understand African culture before we got down to Johannesburg. And that was a very valuable experience in this regard. But then we came on down through northern Rhodesia and southern Rhodesia, and then landed in Johannesburg on the morning before people knew that we were there. And so we looked up in the telephone directory of the Society of Friends, because we belong not only to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, but also to the wider Quaker Fellowship. Although we're not Quakers, wherever we went, we tried to find Quakers because we knew that they were involved in the cutting edge of a witness dealing with the social and the international problems of those areas. And there we met Dr. Will Fox, the clerk of the Friends meeting. And he found that we had been associated with Quaker activities and FOR activities and other reconciliation activities in the United States in crossing the color bar in our country. And then, so that very first Sunday we were there, he said, would you be willing to organize an interracial work camp project? And we will stand behind you. And we will have my son, he said, Peter Fox, to participate with us. And sure enough, we had an interracial work camp project at Adams College. Now, Adams College had just gone through what was happening in many areas of Central and Southern Africa just after the World War II. There was a series of strikes, believe it or not, on mission stations. Missions that were the first ones to start educational centers in most of the countries of Africa. Now, Mildred and I lived through the Depression days in the early 30s, in which we saw the student restlessness spreading around through the United States. And one thing they had to do was to encourage every class and every school to have elections on people to represent them with the negotiations with the principals or the superintendents of those schools. And then we recognized that same thing beginning to happen in the mission schools in Africa, even in the Bible schools that were established by goodwill mission people. They were done by paternalistic people who meant well and took the initiative, got the money for it. But that wasn't enough in view of the restlessness that was growing in Africa after World War II. And they wanted to participate in the decisions being made to them. If they struck against a mine or a plantation or a business firm, the army would soon be brought out to squash it down. But they were able to practice non-cooperation and strikes on mission stations, and the police wouldn't touch them. So this led to the whole series of problems that the government of South Africa decided to have a commission appointed to investigate to see to what extent communists were causing these problems. After some time, these very important people in South Africa found no evidence that communists were to blame for these problems. And Mildred and I soon recognized that there were problems in the society of paternalism and the growth of nationalism that we were familiar in the United States. And so we were asked to make our own study. And we had the access to the facts of the two members of that commission, Dr. Ray Phillips of the American Board, a congregational board from the United States that was the sponsor of the Unhoffmeyer School of Social Work. And then also Dr. Edgar Brooks, a very prominent educator in Natal. And we were able to share our experiences, make recommendations to the mission boards that were conducting schools, and that had some influence in changes in a number of policies that I don't wish to take time for now. But then, after this Adams College incident, we had an interracial project there. And I won't give you the details on that, but it was a tremendously dramatic thing at that time. And then afterwards, with Eduardo, he was very much active with us in all of these interracial projects that we were dealing with in Africa. The next thing was that this fellowship wanted to keep meeting. So those in the Johannesburg area that we had them from different parts of South Africa and also Rhodesia in the project at Adams College. But then we had a chance of having a fellowship that tried to meet in our home until it became suspicious that we were causing some trouble in the neighborhood and it was at risk with the people in our neighborhoods and ourselves and the participants of that interracial fellowship. So then we started to try to find if we could continue our relationships every month or so in one of the churches, and we found no church that would receive us in Johannesburg because it was a technically difficult time in South Africa with the nationalist government taking more power. So then we found that there was a room in a business building that would let us meet in the Philosophical Society study group room. But then the black people would have had to take the elevator to go up in that, and so that wasn't satisfactory. And then eventually we had meetings at the Bantu Men's Social Club that was a sort of like a YMCA for Africans, and then at the Jan Hofmeyr School of Social Work where I was teaching. And then that led to business people and other writers and other people in the Institute of Race Relations saying, maybe it's time for us to provide a center in Johannesburg for business people, writers, and educators to meet with Africans across the color line openly in South Africa. And that led to us forming the International Club. And that was an interracial club. We were able to get Alan Paton, the author that's well known by most people that are concerned with Southern Africa, to be our president. And we had a big meeting at Gandhi Hall. And then we had a number of other things. Business people helped us to provide 2 floors of an empty building, and then helped to provide facilities for painting and remodeling that so that we could have an ongoing activity in this regard. And that was open to Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and whatnot in this regard. They were all mavericks in their circles. And a number of them, some of them were even a Christian missionary was willing to be he was from the Disciples of Christ, willing to be the chairman of this radical committee. I was organizing secretary because I had initiated the idea with members of our fellowship, and Eduardo Mondlane, and he stood with us in everything. He was a good friend winner, as you know him. He would easily talk with anybody and people would start making friends with him, and they would recognize that he was a brilliant man, and it was like a sponge for knowledge. But he was an activist. He wasn't just a theoretician, he was an activist, and came to our help at any time we wanted to have other people meet him or talk with people and get others in this regard. Now, in this situation, the FOR had members there, and the Quakers, in addition to the Quakers, but there were also business people that were anxious to do business and meet with people who could be future managers and contacts, so they could arrange a time for a sandwich luncheon at the International Club and other kinds of meetings. And people from different boards in Europe and the United States came down here to see what was happening in this radicalization of effort in that regard. And then there were writers and people from the South African Institute of Race Relations and the University of the Witwatersrand and others that joined us in this endeavor. Then we were able to convince the leaders of major denominations in South Africa that it was time to have an interracial conference center where we could have people meet and talk and share discussions. And because of the leverage that was being built up through this international club with all kinds of people, it was possible then to persuade it was time for the church to and that was a major thing because the churches in South Africa are very strong, Afrikaans and English speaking and Roman Catholic and Protestant and the wide variety of people. So getting their leaders to be willing to make was a major thing. And in this case, again, Eduardo was very helpful to us because he was a friend maker and he was an activist being willing to talk with us in this regard. And I was very fortunate that then we started the Wilgersbroot Fellowship Center that kept on, and I just came back 2 days ago from Johannesburg, where I'd spent 5 days at this center, and it's now been acknowledged to be the memorial symbol for the 4 Nobel Peace Prize winners of South Africa. That was Chief Luthuli, who was under trial for treason earlier, Bishop Tutu, Nelson Mandela, and Dr. de Klerk, the vice president under Mandela. And it is exciting to see what that is meaning in that area. My time is up, but I want you to see that when I was there, we were celebrating our 50th anniversary, and I reminded everybody that Eduardo Mondlane was one of the key people to make that a successful project. And I was telling them also that I would be appearing here at Oberlin College at a special conference honoring him. I'm very pleased, Janet, for what is happening there. We want you and Ed and Jude and others of your family and friends to be sure to visit that, to follow that up, because that's a concrete, historic place that helped to liven the environment for making it possible for many changes to take place. Any of you want to know more about what's happening on that, give me your card or a note, and we'll see that you have more information. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. An excellent way to start us off. We'll now hear from Mr. George Hauser. Dr. Reverend George Hauser.
Thank you, Prexy. You know, I must say, I'm nervous. And the reason is that I just learned last night that what I had thought might take an hour has to be done in 10 minutes. I was out here with Jean, my wife, over here in June, and we had a good session with Al McQueen. He's been in touch with us for months about this program. We wouldn't have missed the opportunity to be here. It's so good to see many old friends and to see Janet and Eddie and Jude and so many of you. It's interesting that listening to Daryl, I'm reminded of when I first met Eduardo Mondlane. I met him in 1951. He had just arrived in this country. I think Dorothy Nyland was seeing him around also. And I'm not sure whether Dorothy or whether Daryl introduced me to Eduardo in September 1951 as he was on his way to Oberlin College here. Anyway, that's when I first met him. And my contacts, just to give you an idea of my relationship with him, my contacts beginning in 1951, but then were spaced out over a period of years. Because after finishing here, of course, he went to Northwestern. Occasionally I would see him, or maybe we would have correspondence, or meet each other at a conference someplace. Then he came to New York, I believe in 1957, and joined the trusteeship staff at the United Nations. I was at that time executive director of the American Committee on Africa, and I spent a great deal of time at the United Nations. I spent a great deal of time with Eduardo at his desk there on, I forget which floor it was, in the trusteeship division. I can remember going into his room one day when a couple of men were leaving, and he said to me as I came in, "Do you know who those men were?" I said, "No." He said, "They were Portuguese government people. They keep an eye on me, and from time to time they come in here and offer me a job teaching in Portugal. They don't want me in the United States. They don't want me in Mozambique. They would like me to be in Portugal." And of course he had come to the United States in order to avoid the PIDE, the security police in Portugal. At any rate, over the period of years, I saw him very frequently in New York, and we would have long discussions. That's when I first met Janet, of course, because they had been married, I think, in 1956, and came to New York in 1957. But then during the years after Eduardo and Janet went back to Africa, to Dar es Salaam, 1962, from then on until his tragic assassination in 1969, I passed through Dar es Salaam very frequently. And always I was in touch with Eduardo and with Janet. And he would explain to me what was happening, and we had these long discussions. Now, in the very few minutes that are available to me, I would like to say 4 things about my relationship with Eduardo. One point I would like to make is that he was a good organizer. I can remember getting on a plane in Cairo in October 1964. I was on my way to Zambia's independence, which took place October 24th. And on the way, I stopped in Cairo, was going to Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, and Lusaka. I was so pleased when I got on the plane in Cairo, and there was Eduardo. And we sat together and talked all the way from Cairo to Nairobi, where we were both getting off briefly. Now, I remember this discussion because Eduardo had just been to East Germany. He was a good organizer. And he told me in our conversation that he had been granted by the East German government hundreds of cameras. And I was very interested in this, of course. And then he said to me, indicating what kind of an organizer he said, George, you know, we need a Land Rover for our medical work. Can you possibly get us a Land Rover? And I said, well, I think we can. And we did. As we were talking, however, I said kind of jokingly to Eduardo, all right, Eduardo, we'll get you a Land Rover in exchange for an East German camera. I forgot about this until, I don't know, maybe a year later, when I was passing through Dar es Salaam. And of course, I saw Eduardo, and we spent quite a bit of time together. Time came for me to leave, and he sent one of the top Frelimo officials out to the airport to see me off. And just before I went out to get on the plane, this Frelimo leader thrust a camera in my hands. I had completely forgotten about it, but Eduardo had remembered it. As an organizer, think of what Eduardo and Janet did in getting the first $100,000 grant from the Ford Foundation, which helped them to start the Mozambique Institute. I don't know how many times I've talked with Janet. Is one tremendous organizer herself, as anybody who has worked with her is greatly aware. Then I would like to say that Eduardo was a reconciler and a coalition builder. I can remember visiting Dar es Salaam perhaps in '61. It was before Eduardo had gone there. And I met a man by the name of Malinga and a man by the name of Moli, connected with a group which called itself MANU, the Mozambique African National Union. I met persons who were with an organization called UDINAMO. I met somebody with an organization called UNAMI. I won't bother to give you the names. I couldn't do it in Portuguese very successfully anyway. I went back to New York and I talked with Eduardo, and I said, Eduardo, here you're going to try to start a new organization, and you have already got these organizations on the spot. How are you going to do it? He said, we're going to pull them together. And that is precisely what happened in the creation in June 1962, and then in September 1962, when Eduardo was elected president. That's exactly what happened with the formation of Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front. It also should be known that Frelimo was unique among all of the liberation movements in Africa, and I was in touch with, I think, every one of them, and over a period of years. It was the only one that knew how to handle the Cold War successfully, because Frelimo got assistance from China, they got assistance from the Soviet Union, they got assistance, of course, from the Organization of African Unity, from various African states, from Scandinavian countries, and from Britain and the United States, not through governments, but through the non-governmental organizations, of which I was one. I don't think there was any other of the liberation movements on the African continent that did this. And it was the kind of leadership that Eduardo gave that made this possible. I want to say another thing about Eduardo. He was not what I would call a strict ideologist. I received a letter from him in September 1963, and he said in it, Frelimo, speaking of himself as well, carries no brief for either Western capitalism or Eastern communism. We, of course, believe in socialism, but one type only for Africa. And then, following up the same theme, there was a problem with the CIA, of course, infiltrating Africa and so many of the movements. And this was something which concerned me, representing an American organization, because there was no American organization working on the African field that was not looked upon with a certain degree of suspicion as being one of the cat's paw of the CIA. We've gone through this. I wrote to Eduardo just before Frelimo was to establish an office with Sharfuddin Khan in New York, and our organization helped them a great deal in setting that office up. And I wrote to Eduardo saying, look, aren't you just a little bit afraid about getting the stamp of being a CIA creature or something like that? And he wrote back to me on, this was the April the 10th, 1967. If each time you're telling me, I know, let me finish the point. If each time there is a scandal in any of the countries which support us, and we stampede it out, the Portuguese government would conveniently arrange to create such commotion, believe the CIA scandal is an American tragedy, not ours. It will not help anyone for Americans to warn everybody away from accepting any or all help from the U.S. for fear they may be labeled as agents. Well, I have several more points I would love to make about some of the severe problems which Eduardo had to confront and how he successfully dealt with them, because, you know, it wasn't too simple. It wasn't all fun and roses for the leaders of the liberation movements, of course, as his assassination very clearly shows. But also among his compatriots, there were problems. When the headlines appeared in the Nationalist, the paper in Dar es Salaam, calling him an American stooge, blaming him for attending an American dialogue in Nairobi. I had happened to go through Nairobi just at the time that dialogue was taking place. Eduardo had gone there, and he had been accused by Newsweek magazine of living in a mansion. I was in their mansion in Dar es Salaam, a two-bedroom house in Dar es Salaam, smeared as being a communist stooge, when in Nairobi with the American delegation, and in Dar es Salaam being condemned for going to an American conference where he got in a confrontation, including one with Wayne Fredericks, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and with Osborne Elliott, the editor of Newsweek magazine. And Wayne Fredericks took me aside and said, look, when you go to Dar es Salaam, will you tell Eduardo that somehow or other he ought to make this up with Newsweek, invite them to be the first group to send some delegation into Mozambique, because the armed struggle had already started in September 1964. Eduardo said, when I told him about this, he said, I have no need to set things straight. I'll be glad to talk with Osborne Elliott, the editor of Newsweek, but that is it. This was a man who had a dream and a vision with the organizing ability to carry it out. And I always think of that poem, which was in the greeting of Frelimo in 1969. How can we tell you the size of our dream? During centuries we waited that a Messiah might free us until we understood. Today our revolution is a great flower to which each day new petals are added. The petals are the land reconquered, the people freed, the fields cultivated, schools and hospitals. Our dream has the size of freedom.